Hello, class, and welcome to this week where we're going to continue looking at different types of essays. This week we have compare and contrast essays is what we're going to start with. So it's sort of self-explanatory in that we're going to be comparing and contrasting. We're going to say how things are alike or different within these essays. And as a reminder, that I'm going to be going kind of quickly through some of these slides or concepts because some of the analysis tools that we're using are the same as the previous 3 chapters. So if you need to review that, I encourage you to look at last week's lectures for chapters 7 through 9. So we're going to read compare and contrast essays, and we're going to analyze a student one again, and then for practice, you're going to write something yourself. Remember that we're saying how things are alike and how things are different. In this style of essay, you don't have to do both of those things. So it doesn't have to be compare and contrast. It's kind of like compare and or contrast. But the underlying intent of the essay, like why our writers do these, are kind of the same. That we're just trying to put 2 things up against each other and draw conclusions from it. So the first thing that you need to be aware of is that you have to have 2 things that you can even compare in the first place. So if I were going to compare apples and oranges, well, there's a lot of things I can compare there, right? Even though that's our go-to for things not being the same. It's like trying to compare apples and oranges. They're both fruit. There's a lot in common. But if I said, we're going to compare the weather outside to a Honda sedan, those are very, very difficult things to draw comparisons in a way that is saying anything useful. So, if we're talking about analysis essays in literature, pretty much all literature, you have enough generally that you can pull on to be able to use one of these. But if we're looking at more like nonfiction type things, they need to be in the same kind of genre or class. You're still going to be testing these essays. So you're looking for their main idea, right? That's what a thesis is. And it should tell us whether they're comparing or contrasting or both somewhere within the introduction. Your body paragraphs are going to actually be giving you the evidence and claims for that. And they should pair with the topic sentence. But really you're asking yourself, do they connect and are they effective? What are we supposed to kind of get from the comparing or contrasting in the first place? What does the author want from us? Our conclusion, we should see some sort of coming all together and the author reinforcing their intent. So we were just saying, why is the author doing this? The conclusion should kind of revisit that or guide us to what's next for us. In between each of these paragraphs, we're also looking for transitions. And just like last time, there are specific transition words that tell us or help guide us to the fact that we're looking at a compare-contrast essay. Although, but, however, in contrast, in comparison, likewise, all of these require kind of 2 things, right? Even but, or although one thing, there's this other thing. So all of these have kind of both sides to them, or they're about adding on in some way. Similarly, is like the adding on. You're saying, oh, there's something else, but it's kind of the same. So there are a few ways that you can organize these. You can go point by points, which kind of goes back and forth. So if we're comparing two cars, and maybe we're comparing the two cars on their gas mileage, their economic footprints, and their trunk space or something like that. Then in my first one, where I'm talking about gas mileage, I say car 1 has this gas mileage and car 2 has this gas mileage. And then I go to, trunk space. Car 1 has this trunk space and car 2 has this trunk space. So you can do it that way. Or you can do it subject by subject. I can say, hey, let me tell you all about car A. And I go through everything about car A. Here's its gas mileage. Here's its cargo space. Here's what kind of engine it has under the hood. Here's why you might want it. Okay, now I'm going to talk to you about car B, and I'm going to go through everything. And then I may have my conclusion kind of trying to draw some sort of summary or point about going through it that way. So you see that there's really, the point by point, you really just have one kind of format for it. You have the first point and then both sides. The second point, both sides. The third point, both sides. The subject by subject can happen in a few ways. You can do all of one subject, all of the other side of that first subject, and then same thing. Or you can do what I was saying earlier, where it's like first subject, second subject, and then your conclusion is doing some lifting. So this one is a little bit different in how it looks. It may not be a standard 5-paragraph format, though it's possible for it to still be 5 paragraphs. It would just be tricky. Okay, so now it's time for some practice. And we have an essay called The Twin Revolutions of Lincoln and Darwin. Okay, this is in your textbook. And it was written by a history professor at Ohio State University. And so in it, there's a compare and contrast with these two historical figures. We have Lincoln and Charles Darwin, and they seem very, very different. But we need to always be thinking about what Stephen Kahn, what our author, wants us to take away from this. He has a point or a reason for trying to compare or contrast them. As always, while you're reading, think of your active reading processes. Think of what you already know about Lincoln. He was a president during the Civil War. He helped free the slaves. Think about Charles Darwin. A lot of us think about evolution. And he cataloged a lot of species. It was about survival of the fittest, natural selection. Then you're going to actually read it, and you're going to test it. Okay, so just like the other times, we then break down each particular piece. You're going to first kind of focus on what the essay actually said and how they're alike and how they're different. Think about their structure a little bit as you're going through this. And Kahn highlights heavily how people initially were very resistant to the ideas of Lincoln and Darwin. Why do you think that is? And why do you think that Kahn decides to use both of these figures? And by that, what I mean is you have his purpose where he's really trying to say something about one of these two people, and he's using the other one as kind of like the foundation for it. Where, oh, here's an example of kind of the same idea, and you may not realize that it happens to other people, but I'll give you a clear example so that you can see it with someone else. And that kind of goes into his strategy, right? Where why is he making this comparison? Go ahead and try to find the thesis, and then within that, it may help you isolate the author's purpose here. It's very important to always be looking at the language. So we have the word emancipator here. If we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, we've probably heard of the Emancipation Proclamation, the legislation which freed the slaves. And yet, the author uses the same word for Darwin. And so he's using a more concrete example from Lincoln and applying it to the more abstract concept of Darwin. And why does he do that, and what effect does that language have on the reader? Look at the pattern. Is it point by point or subject by subject? Like, does he go back and forth, or does he really focus on one and then the other? And try to imagine the opposite. If he had written in the opposite way, would that have been more effective or not? Now that we've kind of like talked about each piece, we're supposed to start drawing conclusions. So, did it make sense to compare them? Because they're very, very, very different. And remember, you can refer back to what I said before about one of the two is supposed to serve as a concrete example of something, and the other one is a more abstract example. And then think about which is more an important historical figure. And I would even argue for this particular question to try to forget about America for a second and think about the world. So not like totally discounts that America exists or something, but just think of their global impact and then reassess it. And you may come to a different conclusion than you would just strictly from for America, one of these two is possibly more important. Now that we have analyzed that essay, there's another student one. And it's a good idea to go through it. So this one's about criminal justice. Okay, and you're going to kind of do the same thing, and then you're going to analyze it. Compare and contrast essays are very common, and a lot of everyday things you'll be doing in like an office job come down to comparing and contrasting things. For example, your boss may say, hey, decide on this and justify it. Okay, so I'm now having to choose between different things and then say which one was better or worse and why. Just to kind of recap, remember that we may be doing both comparing and contrasting, but it might not be. It may just be differences, or it may just be similarities. And we need to always be thinking about our purpose. So, what is it that we want at the end? Are we supposed to choose one over the other? Or are we showing that there's an alternative that's just as good? What is it that we really want the reader to take away from it? Okay. We have three different assignments, and then some example thesis statements. You see that this one is trying to show the first one is trying to show comparisons. The second one is trying to show differences. And the third one is going to be a both. It's going to be compare and contrast. All right, so it's a good idea for you to practice this yourself, even informally, even if it's just an outline. It will help you. I advise you to take two things that you're passionate about. Maybe you're passionate about cars, maybe it's about food. Maybe you decide to compare and contrast Chinese and Italian food or something like that. Make an outline. Think about the process and think about how you would guide readers to a conclusion that you want. Okay, and then you, of course, test it again. All right, so let's kind of go through this process with a student writer from your textbook. So it says some people claim that males and females are so different that at times they seem to belong to two different species. Do you agree, or do you think males and females are more alike than different? That was their assignments. And before we even look at anything else for this particular student, you should self-assess, what do you think on that? And I think it's one of those questions where you can kind of be swayed based on the framing of it or how they start. That it's very easy to think of stereotypical differences between the sexes, and yet at the end of the day, we're human, and so there's a lot of overlap there as well. And you could get into a semantic argument with the definition of something like species. Okay, so what does our student do? Well, she notices the words different and alike, so she sees, oh, I'm going to be comparing and contrasting. She narrows the topic to just 7th graders. She drafts a thesis and goes with the most obvious things. She decides on her structure, point by point, and then she actually writes it. She tests it, of course. She revises it. She makes everything more specific and reinforces her examples and adds transitions. So you can read the essay itself, and then there are some practice questions for you to look at. Okay, the last thing for this chapter we're going to talk about is parallel structure. And parallel just means that they're supposed to be treated the same. Let's look at, and I'm going to tell you that this is a tough one because sometimes it's hard to see at all. I think once you see it, it's not so bad, but it's tough to see that there's something that's supposed to be parallel at all. Okay. So there are two ways that parallel structure can come up. One is within a singular sentence. If we're looking at something being listed. So wakes up late and has to hurry. They have to be treated the same. So if you notice in this case, the verb tense is the same. Wakes and has are both the same. So you couldn't say Johnny, an average 13-year-old boy, woke up late and has to hurry and have it be parallel structure in that way. You would say he woke up late and had to hurry. But it also can be between sentences. So they're saying that we're doing a compare and contrast here. So we have one sentence about Johnny and one sentence about Jane. And you see that they both start with the wakes up. One is just late, one is early. And then they go to whether they have to hurry or not. If one had been rearranged, if our first sentence was exactly the same and our second sentence said Jane, unlike Johnny, takes her time and wakes up early, that would no longer be parallel and it would be considered weaker writing. Okay, so just to kind of review, compare and contrast essays can be either or. It can be both. It can just be one. We're always going to be testing our essays, and this is a common one that comes up. Don't forget about those transition words. And now we're going to be looking at chapter 11, which is the same thing but with argumentative essays. It's important to note that a compare and contrast essay with a specific goal can be a type of argument. Okay, but not all argumentative essays need to compare or contrast. Both can have a clear goal where the author wants you to do something. In a persuasive or argumentative essay, the author has a clear goal for you. So we just had a presidential election not long ago. And if we were reading an essay about one of those candidates, the goal or purpose that the author would have for writing that would have been, prior to the election occurring, would have been to get you to vote for a particular candidate. So we're always going to be looking at what the author's goal here is. We're going to look at reading these, analyzing these, and then writing them. An argument, of course, is some sort of conflict. It's something you can take a side on, and it's something that can be debated. But it doesn't have to be something done in anger. So a debate, it says a contention by words or arguments, and contention just means something that's not agreed upon. It's not agreed upon. So what are some topics that people can argue about? We have, if you've heard of UBI, Universal Basic Income, that's something that has come up in the past 10 years or so, and people have very strong feelings about it. Have things like death penalty, should all education be online? The answer to that one is no. What should the legal drinking age be? Y'all tend to be younger in this class, so I'll even let you in on a little bit here, is that the drinking age used to be different depending on what state you were in. That for a long time, the drinking age was 16 in Louisiana, and the federal government said that they were going to withhold highway funding unless the states changed the drinking age to 21 in order to hopefully lower drinking and driving fatalities. Okay, people have very, very different views on gun control. And a big topic in this last election had to do with illegal immigration. So remember, they're trying to convince you of something, and they're doing it hopefully by presenting evidence, but not always. It's not always going to be a fact or a statistic, and sometimes their way of trying to convince you may technically be a logical fallacy. So, for example, if I said, I have 20 experts here that all say X is true. Okay, that's technically a logical fallacy. Just because everyone in the world agrees on something doesn't make it true. It just means that we all agree on it. The only thing that should be presented as evidence in a perfect world would be facts, statistics, right? That sort of stuff. Something that you can verify via experimentation to be true or measure it. However, human beings don't work that way. Like, all of our ads are not facts and statistics, are they? They appeal to your emotions. And so, too, an effective argumentative essay is going to appeal to someone's emotions. We're going to be going through a lot of the same stuff. You'll always be testing things. The thesis should have a clear position and then kind of tell you what their evidence is going to be, the highlights of it. Remember, it can be facts or opinions. It can be evidence or something to get you emotionally riled up. in each paragraph. And the ending of the essay should have some sort of call to action. What is it that they want you to do now that you believe that they're correct? Okay, our transition words. So this essay, just like the others, have specific words that go with it. You see that some of them are similar to in other places, but you can still kind of say, oh, based on all of them put together, I kind of can tell that this is an argumentative essay. We have inductive and deductive arguments. So an argumentative essay can be organized either inductively or deductively. Inductive means you're moving from specific to a general thing. So you are looking at something, okay, and you are saying, oh, I notice this is true, so it must apply to everything else. So, for example, I notice that birds have wings and they fly, right? So I notice like eagles, they fly. And I notice that ducks, they can fly. And they have wings. And so I noticed that blue jays, they have wings and they fly. Therefore, all birds must be able to fly. Okay, well, we know that that's not true. And so this type, making an induction, this type of argument is risky to make because you're trying to draw a conclusion that applies to like everything. It can work. How we make categorical distinctions in the first place is we observe things and then apply it generally. But you just have to be careful because it can be misleading. Okay, deductive is the other way around. So if we take something overall major, like some sort of big idea, and then we break it down, that would be a deductive argument. Okay, so we're going from the big to the smaller. So for example, maybe we say that trucks are useful work vehicles. Okay, and then our minor premise, as we get more specific, are that all of these different professions aid from it, and therefore our specific conclusion is you should buy a truck. Okay, so we're going from the big thing, and then we're giving more specific examples and whittling it down to a specific conclusion. Okay, so the one on the slides here says all workers are entitled to a living wage. That's our huge claim. And so if we start there, then we can look at the most extreme example on the other end, which are if you make minimum wage. And then our conclusion could be, oh, okay, well, if they can't make a living wage, then maybe we need to increase the minimum wage. Argument essay has the kind of the most straightforward structure of the essays we've been looking at so far, and then it has an introduction where you have a clear position. You have multiple paragraphs of explanation and evidence, and then you just end it with a clear call to action. Okay, so we see that some different formats for it are basically the same. The only thing that you may have that's unique is you may have what's called a counterpoint. It's where you say, hey, I know my opponents, I know someone else may argue against me by saying this, but they're wrong because... So you're fighting what people might say or might have in their mind against your argument. There is a essay here in praise of the F word. Okay, and you're going to read it and then kind of analyze it. You're going to annotate it up. You're going to say what you agree or disagree with, and you're going to test it. The big thing with whether you disagree or agree with it is how much do you agree or disagree with based on that they were just not able to convince you from a position you already held, or was it something you haven't thought about and they just weren't able to convince you? Because those are two very different things. You could go into something with such a strongly held belief that no matter what anyone says, it's not going to convince you. But if you have no belief on something and you go in and they're still not able to convince you, that's a very, very different conclusion to draw about effectiveness. So this is all about grades and diplomas and whether we should be doing it. So you're going to kind of go through, you're going to see whether you think that failure is a good motivator or requirement for true success. As a student, you probably already have a strongly held belief on this. And then where's the thesis? And Sherry is a teacher. And remember, just because she's a teacher doesn't mean she's right. But why would being a teacher help her be believable or help it be convincing? If we're looking at the words that she uses, the title is a great place to look. Because we have the F word, and we know that that usually refers to something else. But here it's referring to grades. So why does she use it that way? Why would she make it a bad word in that sort of sense that no one's supposed to say? Look at the pattern and decide whether this is inductive or deductive. And then consider the fact that she is saying that the older someone gets, the less it's about like teaching them and the more it's about triage or repairing them. Okay. She then extrapolates that because they were never failed in school, it will affect their motivation later in life. What does it mean to have a healthy fear of failure? Okay, you're gonna, now that we're kind of done with that, you're gonna be looking at another one, and they had a prompt. Should the government play a major role in most aspects of our lives, or should we be free to make our own choices? This is a very, very important issue and thing to think about in terms of your political beliefs. That you have both extremes are obviously not good if you take them to the total extreme, right? That if anyone could do anything that they wanted, it would be terrible because you could murder or steal or anything. But if you get no choice, you're essentially a slave. But then if we're in a more reasonable middle ground and we're having a question about should all foods be available to everyone, or should there be disincentives or bans on certain foods as well? Like some different countries have bans on the amount of added sugar that you can have in things, or may restrict what kind of food dyes can go into things. Like, what's the line and where's the line for that? Okay, so you're going to go through the active reading stuff as well. You're going to test it. You're going to look at it. It's MLA format, and she even has a works cited page where she'll put information about all of her sources. You'll fill out the essay map, and you'll decide whether it's effective or not. Argumentative essays, I feel like, are some of the easiest to write and also analyze, so hopefully you find that to be true as well. The part that gets difficult is the analysis of it and seeing where, or making a conclusion about how effective it was. Because an author or an essay are not effective towards us, or maybe they are effective towards us, regardless of how we personally feel, it may be completely different in general. So for example, I may find that her essay is very convincing. I may love it to death, but I may be in the minority. Most people may hate it and say like, oh, it wasn't effective at all. It's very hard for me to remove my personal feelings and be able to objectively say, even though I like this, I know most people won't like this. So it's hard to do that, but I want you to try. So it's not necessarily how effective you think the author is with you. It's how effective do you think the author is in general to society. You make arguments all the time, whether you realize it or not. If you say, when you were a teenager in high school, you wanted to hang out with your friends, and you went up to your parents, you were making an argument. You were saying, oh, I want to do this thing because. That doesn't go away. We have arguments all the time. You're at work. Oh, we should do things differently because. Or maybe you need someone to take your shift. You should take my shift because. All of those things are arguments. Kind of a review of, or some examples of some prompts and some thesis statements. Notice that our thesis statements have clear positions. I would argue, though, that these don't get specific enough about what examples we're going to see in the entire essay. Okay, you're going to test all of those things. And we're going to follow a student writer. So they had to pick, Alex Norman had to pick a controversial issue. And Alex here did some research looking at whether government should subsidize the cost of college for low-income students. But he realized that nothing is free, and so if the government is doing it, that means that other people's taxes are used for those people. And he wasn't sure which. He's saying, well, on one hand, it could help the people who wouldn't be able to pay for college. On the other hand, it makes life more expensive for everyone. He brainstormed. He did a T-chart. T-charts are great for both sides of stuff. And then he picks a side, not maybe based on everything that he was able to come up with, but the side that he's going to more passionately be able to articulate should be the side that he takes. So that's not always your personal belief. It may just be that you feel one way, but you have easier examples to talk about on the other side. If the point is just to write an argumentative essay, it's about what's most persuasive. You write your thesis statement with your points. Remember, you're going to have a position. Then you test it, proofread it. And there's a final draft there. Increase grant money for low-income college students, which the title itself shows off his position. When you read it, you're going to figure out where that thesis statement is. You're going to find the examples, look at the transitional words, refer back to the slides with the transitional words, look in the conclusion, was there a summary, and then evaluate the essay. Okay, our last little grammar thing for today is that when you're writing argumentative essays, you really need to show relationships. And so you need to be using compound and complex sentences. And let's talk about what compound and complex sentences are. And then I want you to consider compound and complex sentence, like both of them as one sentence. Okay, so a compound sentence is where you have two complete sentences joined together with like a comma and a conjunction. The federal government does have a program in place to help students who demonstrate need. If we put a period there, it could stand on its own. It's an independent clause. It's great. Pell Grant funding needs to be expanded. That also is a complete sentence. So if we have two complete sentences joined together, a comma alone can't hold them together. It's not strong enough. You need a conjunction like but as well. So if you have two complete sentences joined, that is compound. A complex sentence, on the other hand, is when you have a dependent clause. So that's an incomplete sentence joined with a complete sentence. Although some critics see these grants as unnecessary handouts. Okay, so if I stopped there and put a period, you would be saying, oh, yeah, and? Because there's not enough there. It's not a complete sentence. If we keep going, though, such awards are the best way for the government to invest in the future and to maintain our nation's core values, period. That is a complete sentence. So when we have an incomplete sentence, a dependent clause with a complete sentence, an independent clause, a comma alone, this one by handouts, is strong enough to hold them together. Okay, don't forget to always test your essays, to annotate them, do all that good stuff. That is the end for this week. Next week, we are going to kind of start moving away from all these analyzing essays. Keep working hard on everything, and I will hear from you then.